Hello everybody, my name is Stefan Kirchner and I'm going to teach a course on human rights and human security in the Arctic as part of the Arctic Studies program at the University of Lapland in this academic year, specifically this autumn. The course is going to consist of 3 lectures on the 17th, 18th and the 19th of November. In addition, I'm going to give an introductory lecture on the 8th of September, all from 2 to 4 p.m. online, potentially also with an option to have a screening within a building, but preferably online in order to allow all the students to participate and to, of course, engage in the necessary physical distancing in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic. The course is going to be organized in the form of an inverted classroom, meaning that we're going to use the interaction during the calls. We still have to see if we're going to use Zoom or another medium, the software for this. But the interaction during the calls, there's going to be a discussion between the students, myself. So I want you all to be interactive and have an interactive participation here. That's important. That's actually 80% of the grade. So keep that in mind when deciding whether or not to enroll for this course. The inverted classroom idea requires you to do a bit of work before the actual event, and that's why I'm going to put all the slides online, additional material online, as well as a couple of short videos like this one. We're going to look at the Arctic as a space where people are living. That's why the first lecture on the 8th is also entitled The Arctic, Our Home. The title is taken from a video you might already have seen on YouTube, which is on the channel of the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland, where the Arctic Center staff, or some of my colleagues, they're talking about what we are doing at the Arctic Center. The same idea is behind the first lecture on the 8th of September. I myself, I'm a halfway an outsider. I came to Finland 7 years ago, been working at the University of Lapland since, first teaching human rights and indigenous rights at the law faculty, and since 2016 at the Arctic Center as a researcher and now associate professor for Arctic law. The Arctic, nevertheless, is in some way also my home. It's home, first of all, for the indigenous communities, but it's also home for a lot of migrants, people who made this their home. And of course, it's a popular destination for people who come here for studies, for tourism, of course, but also to work in the industry, for example, in mining. So the Arctic has become home to a wide range of people from very different backgrounds, from people who can trace their heritage on this land back thousands of years, indigenous Sami people, to people who basically just arrived very recently. For example, refugees who came here during the last few years. We are going to look at different challenges for these different groups of people in the Arctic. We're not just going to look at Lapland, but at the wider circumpolar Arctic. That means looking at the situation in Siberia, in Greenland, in Canada, and so on. The idea is that you get an understanding of what's going on in the Arctic in terms of human rights, in terms of human security. We're not going to be able to cover everything in 4 lectures, of course, but I want you to get an understanding of some of the challenges that the people in the Arctic are facing. I want you to be able to understand why security matters and how it matters for the people of the Arctic, both on a local scale but also on a global scale. And most importantly, I want you to understand the human rights dimension of Arctic governance, of the decisions which are made for the Arctic, for the people who live in the Arctic, often by decision makers far away from the Arctic. Now, what is the Arctic? The Arctic can be defined in multiple ways. The polar circle, the Arctic Circle, is of course one way to define it. Other definitions look at things like permafrost or average temperature or vegetation. North of the polar circle, we still have 4 million people who call the Arctic their home. If you go a bit further south, until around 60 degrees north, the number increases to about 12 million people worldwide. So this is not a small population. The Arctic is not an empty space. It's a home for a lot of people. On a global scale, of course, the number of people living in the Arctic is very small. That's something you need to keep in mind when discussing the Arctic. The population density here is extremely low. Finnish Lapland is one of the more populated areas in terms of the population density across the circumpolar Arctic. The perceptions that outsiders have of the Arctic can vary dramatically from the reality here on the ground. And it's important to keep that in mind because a lot of decisions are made far away from the Arctic. They're made in national capital cities like Moscow or Helsinki or Washington DC or Ottawa, but these decisions have a huge impact on life in the Arctic. The Arctic is undergoing dramatic changes nowadays. Climate change is the most obvious of these impacts. Globalization is another one. Globalization has positive and negative sides. It connects people much more, but it also brings to the Arctic significant challenges. Climate change dramatically impacts the people who live in the Arctic, especially indigenous communities who depend on traditional livelihoods. Reindeer herding, fishing, things like that, they become more and more difficult. While others might see climate change as an opportunity for profit. There's more mining, for example, in Russia. There's more oil exploration planned, for example, in Alaska. And there's growth in demand for tourism, cruise tourism, for example, along the Arctic Ocean. And as climate changes elsewhere too, the Arctic is also becoming more and more popular ski tourism destination. Because this is one of the last places where you actually have good skiing conditions, while the snow in the Alps and elsewhere is disappearing rapidly. For the people who live here, climate change can be an enormous burden if your traditional way of life suddenly becomes impossible. If everything you learned from your parents or your grandparents changes insofar as traditional knowledge loses its value. We are therefore also going to look at the social dimension of human rights and human security. We're going to look at indigenous rights. We're going to look at human rights in general, at international human rights treaties. And we're going to look at how international law can be used to govern the Arctic. We're going to look not just at the governance of empty spaces such as the Arctic Ocean, which the center part of which is beyond national jurisdiction, but we're also going to look at the way international law can shape governance of the Arctic within Arctic nation states. Indigenous rights, norms, human rights treaties, they're important aspects of this. We are also going to look at the role of international cooperation. In the media, there's often this perception of the race to the pole, the race towards Arctic resources, or scramble for the Arctic. The reality in the Arctic is often much more one of cooperation, also cooperation across political divides, across international borders. That too is something we're going to look at. We're going to look at institutions like the Arctic Council and at the role that civil society can play there, for example, the representatives of indigenous organizations. But a look at human security and human rights in the Arctic wouldn't be complete without a look at the local situation as well. Urbanization, for example, is one issue. When you look at the distribution of the population in the Arctic, you're going to notice that there are a couple of centers, which themselves are part of the periphery, surrounded by a larger, almost human-free space. This space is not human-free, of course. It's home to many people. Nevertheless, urbanization plays an important role in the Arctic because services are centralized. I'm recording this video on the southern slope of Aunasvara. Aunasvara is basically the main hill here in Rovaniemi. And if you hear a bit of noise in the background, that's a road just a few hundred meters down here from here. I'm roughly halfway between the top of Aunasvara, which is a popular tourism destination. On the other side of the hill, there are skiing facilities in wintertime. And in that direction, about the same distance, there's a central hospital for Lapland. So key piece of the infrastructure here in the region. The centralization of infrastructure is a key problem. It also means that large parts of the infrastructure in the Arctic are not really available to everybody in the Arctic. and the availability of infrastructure, such as roads or telecommunication. That's also crucial for the future of Arctic communities. Now with the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people are working more from home, and the idea of remote work is something that is more and more accepted also by employers here in Finland. And that's really good news for people in the Arctic, because it's becoming more possible to actually work internationally, to have a better career opportunities while living here, due to the possibility of remote work. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic is of course a huge challenge. Here in Rovaniemi, we had one of the early cases in Europe where tourists came from China and who thankfully recovered after a short time. But healthcare is a challenge. It's a challenge especially in the remote communities, and that too is a question of human security and human rights. You have a human right to access adequate healthcare, of course, to the best of the ability of the nation states. So while there's not necessarily a right to have perfect healthcare everywhere, there's a minimum standard of healthcare that you can expect. And Arctic states have very different approaches to this. They have very different ways to provide healthcare. This is just one of the many examples of the challenges that people in the Arctic are facing when it comes to security, safety to a certain degree. We'll talk about the distinction between safety and security in the English language also, and what that means in terms of governance. But at the end of the day, this is also important in terms of human rights. We're going to look at international human rights treaties, but what comes down to really is that at the end of the day, human rights are realized on the local level. It's a local administrative staff member, it's a local judge, local lawyers, and so on, who are the ones who are actually tasked with making human rights real for individuals on the local level. As a result of this course, I would like you to have a better understanding of these challenges that people in the Arctic are facing, be they newcomers like myself or people whose families have been here for thousands of years. We're going to look at different challenges and at different approaches to these challenges. I'm looking forward to this course, even though it's very different, of course, due to the pandemic from other courses. But I hope you get to enjoy this a bit, and that you get to learn a bit about the Arctic, the people who live here, and of course also about Rovaniemi and Lapland. I'm going to put a lot of material online, and I know a lot of the participants are not going to be actually physically in Lapland to take this course. Therefore, wherever you take the course, I hope you get to enjoy it. Feel free to ask me anything, write me an email. If you have a question, we'll have plenty of time to discuss during the actual lectures. And wherever you take this course, make sure you engage in social distancing, physical distancing rather, hygiene, and wear a mask. Beat COVID. Thanks.